is the need to have responsive interactions with adults.
Neglect for children is when they don't get what the brain is expecting to get, what the child is expecting to get, what we are biologically prepared and waiting for, which is input from those around us.
It's this back and forth serve and return interaction that literally shapes the architecture of the brain.
Serve and return begins when a child looks at something or observes something, makes an utterance, and that represents the serve. And the return is when the parent notices the child doing these things and responds to the child.
Under conditions where serve and return is broken, you literally are pulling away what is the essential ingredient of the development of human brain architecture.
It was a really compelling series of experiments where they started by videotaping the mother and the baby engaging in cooing and smiling. And then they asked the mother to basically put on a blank face and not respond at all. When a baby is not attended to, that is a sign of danger to the baby biologically. So the stress systems become activated.
In a brain that is constantly bathed in stress hormones, not that's up and down, that comes with normal development, certain key synapses, the connections between nerves, fail to form, and critical regions of the brain.
So neglect both fails to provide the stimulation that's needed to develop the basic architecture, and when it's at a certain level, is one of the most potent activators of the stress biology of a young child. So you get a double whammy.
Science points to 4 categories of this spectrum of neglect. The first category would be what's called occasional inattention, where children experience responsiveness most of the time, but occasionally adults don't respond. There's no harm in that, and in fact, there's probably some benefit.
A child can learn to self-soothe and explore the environment, and all of those opportunities build brain architecture.
The second category, scientists would call chronic understimulation, is where on a regular basis, children have less interaction with the adults around them than is needed for healthy development.
Those children typically, when provided with enriched learning opportunities and more typical levels of serve and return, will show catch-up.
The third category is what science would call severe neglect in a family where not only are there prolonged periods of inattention and lack of responsiveness, but often also associated with not being fed enough, not being bathed enough, not having basic needs met.
Neglect is a huge problem in the U.S. Children are much more likely to be neglected than they are to experience any other kind of maltreatment.
We see the child really being at risk for much more substantial kinds of deficits down the road that don't necessarily get easily fixed or ameliorated. This is where we really need to think about more complicated and often more intensive strategies to help undo those effects.
The fourth category, called severe neglect, generally found in institutional settings, is the result of children living in kind of warehoused type situation in orphanages.
And it doesn't have to even be as extreme as orphanages. It can be experiences that are regretfully occurring in many, many parts of our country.
Often institutional care in this country is under the euphemistic name of transitional care or temporary care or assessment facilities.
If you think about what institutional or residential care would look like for an infant, where there's somebody new coming onto the shift every 8 hours, it really alters the development of the child's brain architecture and other aspects of the child's development.
We have the potential to change children's developmental trajectories.
Interventions can apply to parents, to foster parents or adoptive parents, child care settings, Head Start settings, and other kinds of settings. And really, what they're about is attuning people to the serve and return process.
Neglecting young children is neglecting the foundations of a healthy, next generation. The community pays a huge price later in terms of the problems of the next generation, whether it be educational achievement, economic productivity, good citizenship, the ability to parent the next generation. All of the things that have to do with a healthy, prosperous society.
Interesting. The more I read into childhood neglect, the more I realize that my childhood was not normal and I was severely neglected, even though I thought it was normal. I remember times when I was a kid that my hands and feet would turn completely black because I wouldn't bathe and my parents were absent about 95% of the time. The only time I ever seen them was if I went upstairs into their room, which usually they would tell me to leave because they're smoking weed or something, or asking them for a ride to school, which usually resulted in a lot of yelling because I should be able to do that on my own from the age of like 10. But I thought it was broken for a second. It's just the battery dead. I thought I got it wet the other day. It stopped working, but it seems to only want to charge on this battery, I guess. Whatever. I don't know. I'm having some issues right now. I think I'm gonna go call my son's pediatrician because he just lately, as in the last like couple of weeks, he's really like been physically beating me up a lot. He's been like, and it's not even like when I try to look up stuff about it or reach out for help, people are like, oh yeah, kids have tantrums. No, he's doing this in a calm and calculated manner. He's not doing this in like a, oh, I'm upset, so I'm gonna hit you. No, he is smiling and laughing and beating the shit out of me and the cat, and I just can't get it. I can't get an empathetic response out of him. I literally cried today, and he acted like he just won a game. He was smiling and laughing, like getting in my face, and I was just like, stop! You're making mom sad. And I can't find any information on what to do. Like, everyone's just like, oh, when they're upset and they're having a tantrum, you gotta, like, divert it and you have to give them a hug and blah, 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 blah. Like, he is doing this because he wants me to be upset. And you can say, oh, he doesn't understand that. No, I asked him, why are you hurting mom? You're gonna make... And he says, sad. And I'm like, you want mom sad? And he's like, yeah. And I'm like, why do you want mom sad? And he says, bye-bye. And I was like, you want mom to leave? And he's like, yeah. And I said, that makes mom sad. And he's just like smiling like, yeah, that's what I was trying to do, yeah. He's 2. I didn't know what to do. So I just, I cried. He didn't care. Like, I asked him to give me a hug and he gave me one, but it was more like he wanted it. Like, that's what he wanted. He wanted the positive. He wanted me to be affectionate. You know what I mean? And so, like, the only thing I could think about doing, because usually when mom's sad, I'm just kind of like, give mommy a hug, you know, whatever, like, mommy's sad or whatever. Like, it's like he won a game or something. So it's just like, I can't positively reinforce that. I didn't know what to do. He wanted me to leave. He said bye-bye. He wanted me to leave. So I was just like, do I give him what he wants? I cried on the couch, and he fucking thought it was great. And I said, why do you do that? Why do you hurt the cat? Why he's so sad? And I was just like, you want us to be sad? Yes. I didn't know what to do, so, and I just couldn't handle it, so I just came into my room here, and I locked him out, and, he wasn't even upset. He didn't care. Usually he's screaming at my door when I go to my room, but he wanted me to do it this time, so I was just kind of like, what the fuck do I do? And I'm just sitting there laying in my bed thinking, like, what do I do? And I could just hear him playing on his tablet, so I was just like, fuck this, fuck that. So I went out there and I grabbed his tablet from him and I turned off the TV and I turned off the lights, and it was only like 8:30 and he's been going to bed at like midnight lately, and I was just like, I just took everything away and went back into my room. I didn't even say anything, didn't even look at him. I just took his tablet into this room, not even so that he can try to climb up on a shelf to get it, and just like turned it off, and it was just turn the TV off, because usually he can just pump tapes in all he wants all night. Like I usually just let him go to bed and he can watch a bunch of VHS tapes, which is all just like Blue's Clues and Bear in the Big Blue House and like Disney stuff. So it's just like, but like after like an hour or so, he started crying at my door, and he ignored it, and he stopped crying like within a minute. Like he was just doing it to get me out, and so he was just it was weird because he was just quiet. Because it's what he asked for. He'd cry when he changed his mind because he wanted attention. But he didn't care. He didn't care. But he's been like hurting the cat for the longest time now, and I always tell him, when the cat scratches him, I'm like, good. You were mean to the kitty cat, he was allowed to scratch you. You're not allowed to be mean, but he doesn't fucking care. He legitimately does not have an empathetic response to seeing me upset, and it just made me cry harder, because, like, I don't want him to turn out like his dad. His fucking dad's fucking psycho. I didn't even understand for a long time that he was just pretending to have emotions, like a schizo. What the fuck?
Hello, I'm Darren McGee. Today's question asks if I would discuss sadistic behaviours and traits, a sadistic personality. Now, if you like this video, if you find it helpful or interesting, please consider subscribing to my channel. But just as a reminder, this video is not a substitute for support from a mental health professional, nor is it a tool to be used to diagnose someone. Now, sadistic personality disorder was introduced
by definition. You can't be a psychopath until you're an adult. But there are studies of looking backward to see what psychopaths were like when they were children. And they often had some very disturbing behavior. And in fact, in order to make the diagnosis with confidence that you have an adult who has no conscience, who has no empathy for others, who doesn't really care about being good, you go back to their childhood and you see, yes, they They enjoyed setting fires. They tortured animals. They were mean to other people. They never really had tenderness, interest in others, but they learned what it took to get favors. So a psychopath, by definition, nowadays, is someone who is an adult, who has no conscience, who may or may not be sadistic. And that's an interesting addition, because in popular fiction, we're fascinated with these characters like Hannibal Lecter, who not only have no conscience, but they also enjoy hurting other people. But I would say children can be on their way, but you shouldn't make the diagnosis until they've grown up. There have been some articles lately, a really fascinating one in the New York Times about kids and good parents who are just torturing themselves, trying to do the right thing with a child who is manipulative, unfeeling, destructive. My belief is that the core concept in a psychopath is the absence of conscience. And you don't form a conscience until you're 5 or 6 years old. So you can't really tell until a child is that old. But between 5 or 6 and the time they qualify for adult classifications, yeah, you can see that somebody is behaving and developing along that way. Now, my friend and colleague, Robert Hare, I consider the world expert on psychopath. He really knows way more than I do and way more than most experts do. He has studied them. I tend to study the victim. I'm interested in the psychopath because sometimes victims have run into them, and they can blame themselves for having an encounter with a person who behaves really like a beast. So at any rate, in order to rate high on Robert Hare's scale of psychopathy, you have to be both a psychopath and a sadist. If you're a sadist, it means you enjoy inflicting pain on others. Sadists sometimes come to psychiatrists when they're not psychopaths, but for some reason they've learned to enjoy inflicting pain on others, and they feel very guilty about it, and they want help in moderating that compulsive behavior. But you see, if you start out without a conscience and then having no empathy for the other person, you find out that you have power over other people. You can scare them. You can get them to do what you want them to do for you. Then I think of this kind of person as having stumbled into sadism, and without a conscience, they can become a psychopathic sadist, and that's the serial killer. That's the person who rapes and kills for the thrill of it. That's a very dangerous predator. Well, what causes the creation of a psychopath in the first place is open to huge debate and speculation. And there are people who study the genetic components, people who study the developmental components in the earliest stages of infancy. So different studies end up with different factors. There's no single gene that makes somebody a psychopath. And what's startling is to find brothers in the same family where one is a psychopath and the other clearly isn't. Some of those are fairly well-known cases, like one of the Columbine killers who really seemed to be psychopathic had a brother who clearly was not. There are twin studies, and they're not exactly concordant, but there tends to be a strong genetic component. So I think we're born with different building blocks. And if those building blocks don't build a conscience, an internal superego, a part of the mind that we can't locate anatomically, but we know what it does. It causes us to feel the sensation of guilt when we know we've done something that violates the rules that we believe in. If we don't have that capacity for feeling that feeling of guilt, that's the major part of being a psychopath. We don't have any stake in correcting our behavior. And some people believe they can teach that, but the jury is out on whether you can ever train a full-blown psychopath to be less than a full-blown psychopath.
Welcome to my scientifically informed insider look at mental health topics. If you find this video to be interesting or helpful, please like it and subscribe to my channel. Hello, this is Dr. Grande. Today's question is, what are the signs that a child could become a psychopath? I've actually been asked this question a number of times in a number of ways. Another version here is, what are the signs that a child has already become a psychopath? And instead of the word psychopath, I've also received this question with the term antisocial personality disorder. Now, I received this question almost a year ago now, so it's been a while. And I had to do a bit of research on this, and also I wanted to talk to a number of clinicians before I attempted to answer this question. There's really a lot to this because you're dealing with a construct like psychopathy, which has a lot of serious consequences attached to it. And then, of course, referring this or relating this to children. And a lot of times in mental health, we don't like to label children as psychopathic. And I'll talk more about that in a moment. So first, let me explore the difference between psychopathy and antisocial personality disorder, because that's an area of confusion, and that really does lend an important component here to this discussion. Like, understand that difference is important here. So psychopathy is a construct. It's not a mental disorder. And it has two factors to it. So really there's two types of psychopathy, primary and secondary. Sometimes they're also called factor 1 and factor 2. And sometimes, to make it even more confusing, psychopathy, factor 1 psychopathy, is referred to as just the word psychopathy. And factor 2 psychopathy is referred to as sociopathy. So we have a lot of terms to really talk about the same two types of psychopathy. Factor 1 psychopathy has traits like being callous, unemotional, manipulative, deceitful, and factor 2 has characteristics that we more typically associate with antisocial behavior, like impulsivity, irresponsibility, and committing crimes. So factor 2 psychopathy, secondary psychopathy, has a stronger association with the mental disorder antisocial personality disorder. So that is an actual mental disorder in the DSM, in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, so somebody can be diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder. And again, it aligns with factor 2 psychopathy, and it has some overlap with factor 1 psychopathy. So when you look at the research and you look at how children could have psychopathic tendencies, a lot of times they're talking about antisocial personality disorder and not psychopathy. So to make things even a bit more confusing, antisocial personality disorder can't be diagnosed until age 18. So before 18, another disorder named conduct disorder is oftentimes used. So again, we have, when working with children and the construct of psychopathy, we have a lot of confusing elements here. And when you look at the research, it's not always clear to what they are referring. Psychopathy, factor 1 or factor 2, antisocial personality disorder, or conduct disorder. So to answer this question about the signs that a child will become a psychopath, I titled this video 11 Signs that a Child is at Risk for Psychopathy, because that's what I'm really talking about here. Since we're not going to label children as psychopaths, we're really talking about the risk for future psychopathy. And psychopathy is an important topic. This is a topic that really deserves more attention. There aren't many psychopaths in the general population. Depending on the research you look at, maybe 1%. But we know that psychopaths are responsible for a large percentage of violent crimes. And the exact percent really isn't known because, again, psychopathy is confused with antisocial personality disorder. So we just know it's a fairly large percent. Some estimates say as many as half of violent crimes can be connected to psychopathic traits. So I mentioned before that we don't label children as psychopaths, and kind of talked about conduct disorder a little bit. It's important to understand here that in mental health, again, psychopathy has a stigma attached to it. So a lot of times you'll see this term callous unemotional traits. So you see a child who has low level of guilt, reduced empathy, callousness, and uncaring behavior. Sometimes this is referred to as pre-psychopathic, but I don't really like that term because, again, it kind of suggests that somebody is definitely going to be psychopathic or is likely going to be psychopathic. So instead of psychopathy, we use the disorder, conduct disorder, and specifically with the callous unemotional trait component, there's what's called a specifier attached to that disorder. So it's an element that explains more about the presentation of the disorder. And the specifier for callous unemotional traits is called limited prosocial emotions. So really when you see limited prosocial emotions, that's the same thing as callous unemotional traits. And we know that if somebody has limited prosocial emotions, they're at a greater risk to develop psychopathy. We also know that 80% of children that have this diagnosis will not develop into psychopaths. Of course, that means about 20% will. So that's why, again, we have to take this kind of seriously when we see conduct disorder with limited prosocial emotions. So with all this in mind, when I talk about a sign that somebody could develop psychopathy, that a child could develop psychopathy, it's important to remember that a sign is really, in essence, a risk factor. So we see multiple risk factors in one child and we get worried that they may develop psychopathy someday. But somebody can have a lot of risk factors and never develop psychopathy. So the signs don't necessarily mean somebody definitely will develop psychopathy. They're just things that we see in the literature and different elements I've seen in clinical experience and talking to other clinicians that are poor prognostic indicators. But they don't destine somebody to having psychopathy, or they don't mean certainly they will develop it. Now again, I've used many references here for this video, and I'll put the articles that I've used, I'll put the references for those articles in the description for this video. So let's get started with the 11 signs that a child is at risk for psychopathy. Now, if you want to stop here in terms of this video, if you want to say, well, I don't want to get into the different signs, that's certainly okay. I'm going to avoid being graphic, of course. I'm going to try to avoid being graphic, as I do in all my videos. But some of these signs are a little disturbing. So if you stop now, you still learned a lot about antisocial personality disorder and psychopathy and conduct disorder. So it's a win. You can stop now and you've learned something, and that's good. The details aren't for everybody, certainly. So now moving into the signs. So the first three are referred to as the MacDonald triad. And I've seen all three of these, and they do seem to have a connection to psychopathy, but again, they're no guarantee. The first one is bedwetting. And I'm going to group a few different elements together here. So bedwetting, I also have seen children who urinate on furniture and urinate on other children. And I think these are really kind of two separate issues. Bedwetting, I think, is usually a sign of trauma, or at least it's often a sign of trauma, and that may be how it connects to psychopathy in the future. But urinating on furniture or in places they shouldn't urinate, or certainly urinating on other people and other children, that's more a sign of domination. The literature isn't really clear on this. Some theorists think it's domination, others just think it's aggression. But either way, it's a poor prognostic indicator. So moving to number 2, this would be arson. And this is really not only arson, but a fascination with fire and destruction. I've seen this take many forms, but usually with children that are really young, you'll see getting into matches or looking at flames or candles and being fascinated with that. And then it'll develop into having desire to set small fires, and then sometimes it leads to, again, arson. So it usually doesn't start with no interest and move right to arson. That would be a fairly unusual presentation. Usually it's a fascination that develops over time. And the flames, the looking at flames, looking at videos of flames or fires really captures the attention of the child. That's one of the things I've noticed. It's not something they can really be distracted from usually too easily. There's a genuine interest in flames and destruction and the power of fire. So the third sign is hurting small animals. Sometimes we see this referred to as torturing or killing small animals. And this one's particularly disturbing. Of all these signs, this one really stands out as a particularly poor prognostic indicator. So again, with this one, just like we see with a lot of these signs, it doesn't necessarily start out by hurting small animals. So somebody just doesn't go from nothing to getting a household pet and torturing them. Usually we see this starts with an interest in hurting animals, and one way this is expressed is on stuffed animals. So I've talked to a number of counselors in my career who treat children with conduct disorder and kind of specialize in the area of real behavioral problems like the callous unemotional traits.
See, my kid used to just beat up his stuffed dog, and he'd say, bad dog, bad dog, bad dog. But I'm pretty sure he picked that up from seeing my mom hit her dog, because the dog would bite him, and then she would hit the dog, and he would think it was funny. And I've called her out on it. I'm like, don't hit your fucking dog. Not even just in front of my kid, just don't hit your fucking dog. But then my mom told me that later he would encourage the dog to hurt him in order for the dog to get hurt because he was funny. He would put himself in harm's way just so that he can enjoy seeing the dog get hurt. And I know he's talking about kids that are much older than 2, but I still think that's alarming, because it was like a fun game for him to just beat up his dog. And I'd be like, no, 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 be nice to the dog. And he'll be like, okay, time to pet it. Now I'm going to beat it up. Now I'm going to pet it. And it's just kind of like, he would only do it to the one stuffed animal too. Like the other dogs, he just kind of finds it fun. I haven't really paid attention to how he plays with his stuffed animals, because usually I'm just kind of like, oh, you're having fun, bye. But, well, not like bye, but I'd still be there.
And many of them keep stuffed animals in the office, and they might have like a teddy bear or some other stuffed animal, and they want to see what the children will do in therapy with the animal. And sometimes it's really disturbing, even though it's a stuffed animal, not a real animal. I've had clinicians tell me stories of how children ripped off all the limbs of a teddy bear or a stuffed animal, put the stuffed animal in the door and slammed the door on the stuffed animal's head, flushed the stuffed animal down the toilet, or attempted to, and even tried to set a stuffed animal on fire. So fortunately, I've never heard of an instance where they were successful at setting the fire, but that's fairly disturbing. If somebody's going to do that to a stuffed animal, again, that's a bad sign that they may try to do it to an actual animal. Now, this hurting small animal sign is one of those signs that a lot of times we see when a child comes in for counseling, because this is an indication that pushes parents kind of over the edge. So if the family cat or dog was hurt by a child in the household,
Like, he hurts my cat a lot, like all the time. It's like a fun game to him. Like, my cat is such a sweetheart, he would never scratch him. So, like, I remember one time I was hearing the cat yowl and stuff like that, and I kept telling him, like, leave him alone, leave him alone, leave him alone. And the cat tried to get under the couch, and I think he jumped on his back while he was trying to squeeze under the couch, because the cat was limping. And he's been hit by a car before. I took him to the vet, and they checked him out, and all his bones were moving fine. So I think he just had like a crack or a normal like injury. But he didn't have like a bone break or anything like that. But like, I don't know if he like flared up an existing issue, because he was limping for a while, and then until it was better. But like the cat was like limping again when the kid hurt him, and then it's just like, he's better now, but like I can't get him to stop. I can't get him to stop. He doesn't care. He likes to see me cry. He likes to see the cat and the dogs get hurt. He's never like hurt anybody else. It's just like, he hasn't actually had that much interaction with other kids, and I try to meet up at like parks and stuff like that, but like,
that is a moment when parents would oftentimes seek counseling for a child. So unfortunately, this becomes kind of the entry point, right? So the child hurts a small animal and then they come into therapy. So we don't necessarily see the child before that in a lot of cases. Now, this isn't something that all children with callous unemotional traits do. Again, it's just a sign, it's just an associated feature that we see with callous unemotional traits. Now, the fourth sign or risk factor here is cheating friends, enemies, and individuals who are neutral to the child. So what do I mean by this? Now, with children, we usually don't see fraud or manipulation at the level we would see with an adult, but sometimes we'll see stealing money or stealing toys. So if you think about this and you think of normal child behavior, you think, well, maybe some children would steal toys from other children. This isn't particularly shocking or unusual. But what strikes me with this particular sign is really the cheating or stealing from friends, enemies, and from people that would be neutral. Like, that's the distinction. Usually children will at some point steal toys. That's not, again, super unusual, but not from friends, not from people who already share their toys with them. So that's the line that's being crossed here. If a child views another child as an enemy and they take something from them, that's one thing. It's not pro-social, but that's one thing. But to take toys or other material goods from a friend, that's what really seems unusual to me, and that's really what has a stronger connection to psychopathy. Not recognizing when somebody's an ally, an enemy, or neutral, having no recognition for that boundary, and then just crossing that boundary. Now, the fifth sign really usually applies to children that are a little younger, maybe even as young as 3 or 4 years old, but it can, of course, apply to children a little older as well. And this is ignoring another child who is crying. This is a bad prognostic indicator. One of the theories here is that children who have psychopathic tendencies or traits or callous unemotional traits can't recognize distress in faces. So if they see that another child is crying, they're not going to react to that. That's not something they recognize as being problematic. And the reason that this sign tends to matter, I think, is because we believe that this inability to recognize distress in faces leads to aggression. So one of the things about someone who has a fearful expression or who's crying, in a sense, it can be a sign of submission. It can be a sign that somebody's not a threat to you. But if somebody can't see that sign, if a child can't recognize that another child is trying to move away from a fight or submit, then the child with the callous unemotional traits is more likely to attack. So this really results in a problem where they don't recognize who's trying to dominate them and who's trying to submit to them. They look at everybody as potentially threatening. So again, I'm kind of starting here with ignoring a child who's crying and moving to potential attacks, but that's really what we worry about with this particular sign, as I indicated. The sixth sign is being dominant with an authority figure. So let me give some examples of this. One of the most distressing or alarming symptoms or signs connected with this risk factor is attacking a teacher. If we look at the research literature, we see that when a child commits crimes, like an adolescent commits crimes, and they look back at the history of that child, most of the time they see some sort of incident that involves somebody being dominant with an authority figure, and a lot of times that comes in the form of attacking a school teacher. So this really kind of breaks from the conventional thinking that a child would be kind of afraid to attack a teacher or would submit. Instead, we see a child trying to dominate. I've also seen this with children who attack police officers. Again, that's a poor prognostic indicator. I would say it's a bad sign if a child attacks anyone, regardless of whether that individual is an authority figure or not. But on top of this, what really worries me is when there's a weapon used. So it's one thing to impulsively attack or try to dominate somebody. That's problematic. But to use a weapon kind of shows planning and an intent to really do a lot of damage and potentially lethal damage. So that's even more worrisome when you add the weapon onto the attack. Also, if the attack is unprovoked, that just adds more alarm to that particular sign. So number 7, the 7th sign that a child could eventually be a psychopath, would be committing a crime alone. A lot of times we see that children do commit crimes. It's relatively common, but it's peer pressure that's involved. So they get together with other children, and the worry about consequences decreases, they take more chances, and they commit some sort of crime. Or there's an excitement element tied to it. They want to do something together that's exciting. But when we see children that commit crimes alone, that's a particularly worrisome indicator. Now, kind of tied to this around criminality, I also see that when children get together, sometimes they fantasize about crime. Like they'll see these different movies about a jewel heist, for example, or a bank robbery. And they'll start to plan out the crime, like can they break into the museum or the bank or whatever at night and steal this high-value object. But if an individual has the limited prosocial emotions, the callous unemotional traits, they're more likely to introduce the idea of harming somebody into those crime fantasies. So if children are talking about a bank robbery, kind of hypothetically, again, not seriously planning a bank robbery, but just talking about how they would get away with it, and a child introduces the idea of just knocking the guard out or something like that, that's really jumping to another level of harm, and it's a poor prognostic indicator. So the 8th sign here is a desire to see disturbing images or scenes, and this really connects to the lack of empathy. So if there is an article about a car accident, like in a newspaper or online, and a child accesses that, they may be disappointed because they couldn't see the bodies. They couldn't see the dead bodies in the car accident or the injured bodies. So again, most people may look at the picture, they may want to see how bad the car accident was, but this is really a desire to see that people were hurt. And you could look at this from another angle too. Sometimes with children who have callous unemotional traits, they really mention this idea that they want to see somebody die. They want to actually see a human being pass away. This is something I've heard dozens of times. And it's no less distressing the 20th or 30th time you hear it as it was the first time you hear it. And what's interesting about this is the child doesn't always want to be the cause of the death, but they just want to see the death. Now sometimes they do want to cause the death, and this only magnifies the worry even more. This is really probably one of the most disturbing elements that we see with the callous unemotional traits. When a child says to you as a counselor that they want to cause someone's death because they want to see it take place. So it's disturbing no matter what the reason would be, but for whatever reason, for me anyway, that just strikes me as particularly disturbing. This one is frightening and a very poor prognostic indicator. So moving to number 9, this one is about how sometimes children can be fearless with consequences. So one thing we see with callous unemotional traits is that children aren't afraid of timeouts, they're not afraid of punishment, and they're not even afraid of physical pain. So it's related to fearless dominance, which is a characteristic of psychopathy.
You like how I just mentioned before that he would put himself in harm's way just to get the dog to get beat? Shit's alarming.
Apathy. We also see that after the punishment, they resume the bad behavior almost immediately.
Yep.
So it's really like the punishment, the consequences just don't matter at all. Now what's interesting about this sign though is a lot of times when this is present, a child will still be motivated by reward. So they're not afraid of punishment, but they're still motivated by reward. So it sets up kind of an interesting dynamic when trying to lay out behavioral plans that will help a child move away from callous unemotional traits. The 10th sign is when a child bullies other children. And what's particularly notable here with this one is when there's a desire for the child to create fear in another child. So it's not about just taking something from them, but when a child really wants another person to fear them. And what I find interesting here is, again, we see a deficit in the ability to recognize fear, but that doesn't mean that a child doesn't know that fear exists as a construct. So the last sign, the 11th sign, that a child could potentially become a psychopath is poor parenting. And we see this over and over in the research literature. Cold parenting, having negative reactions to a child when they disclose something, failing to provide a child positive feedback, or being highly critical. And I think as well neglect, any type of neglect and abuse we know is connected to psychopathy. Now what's interesting here is if you look at some of the horrible things that sometimes parents do, it becomes understandable. Like psychopathy children developing into psychopaths eventually becomes understandable. Now, I won't go through some of the things I've seen here because there's too much. But some of the traumatic events, you really just look at the horror behind what children have to endure at the hands of some bad parents, criminally bad parents. You wonder how they could become anything else but psychopathic. It makes sense that the child would become cold and distant and try to have feelings be removed from them, be detached from feelings, and not develop empathy. Now, another part of this, of course, we see in the literature that psychopathic traits in children do seem to worsen parenting practices. So it's not just a one-way street here. Sometimes parenting can lead to psychopathy, and sometimes psychopathy can lead to bad parenting. So just as is the case with all these different signs, the relationship...
Well, like, yeah, like today, I didn't even know what to do. Because, like, he's hitting me, he's making me cry. That should have been a normal, like, I wasn't even guilt-tripping him. I was legitimately sad, and he didn't care. I was looking straight at him, crying, and he was just kind of like, well, look, Mom's sad. You know, like, it made me cry harder because he legitimately didn't care. It was like he won a game. I just dread that he's gonna turn out like his dad.
between the sign and psychopathy is complex. So with all this talk about how children can develop psychopathic traits, callous unemotional traits, and eventually develop psychopathy, is there any hope? Does treatment tend to work? Well, we know that there is some success that has been demonstrated with treatment. So treatment's always a good option.
Like he did that shit like at 9 or like 8:30, and like I didn't know what to do. I just came into this room and I just laid on my bed in the dark. Like I didn't even have my PC on. I was just listening to him because I didn't know what to do. And like I felt like when he was crying at my door, like normally when he's crying, I go to him every single time, but like this time I didn't. Well, like sometimes like in the middle of the night, like I tell him go to bed, but I just didn't even say anything. I just let him freak out, and I felt bad, but punishment isn't gonna do anything. I can't bribe him with a reward. I had to do something. It was a timeout. It was a timeout, and he didn't want the timeout to be over. But I wanted, like, he didn't even care. He didn't even care for like an hour that he was left by himself. Like, he cried for a second because he didn't get his tablet, but after 2 minutes of crying, it got boring, and he went to go find something else to do. And it was just like, I don't know what to do. Like, how do you respond to something like that? Like, how do you get him to stop? How do you, like, he genuinely enjoyed hurting me, and usually I cuddle him to sleep, like, every night. So I told him, no, go to bed, I'm not cuddling you. He freaked out a little bit, but then he didn't even really care. And as I was laying in my bed, I heard him quietly waiting at my door until he fell asleep on the floor. He didn't cry to be let in or anything. It's like I explained every single time he would cry like he cried a little bit, and then I like open the door and I talk to him, and I would stand in the way of the door, and I would just like, you made Mummy sad. I'm not cuddling you. Go to bed. You know, like I was explaining it like that, and he cried a little bit because he wanted my attention, but it's like he didn't want to be consoled. He just wanted me to be affectionate for his own benefit. And I was thinking, like, he can't have a positive experience in response to making me sad. So I just kept telling him to go to bed, and I would just close the door, and he would cry for like 30 seconds, and then he'd be like, oh, shit, that didn't work, and he'd go find something else to do. And like, he fell asleep at the floor of my door, which is not something he usually does, but then again, usually he has a tablet or a movie playing. So
option, and the earlier the better. We know that recovery may be possible, although many clinicians believe that the type of recovery is really simply an adjustment. So a child who develops into a psychopath may develop psychopathic traits, callous unemotional traits, and eventually develop psychopathy. Is there any hope? Does treatment tend to work? Well, we know that there is some success that has been demonstrated with treatment. So treatment's always a good option, and the earlier, the better. We know that recovery may be possible, although many clinicians believe that the type of recovery is really simply an adjustment. So a child who develops into a psychopath may not be an active psychopath in terms of criminality. They may learn to adjust to society's norms. They may still have a lot of the characteristics like low empathy, but they learn that they can get more of what they want by following the law as opposed to breaking the law. So this is kind of a grim view of recovery from psychopathy and a grim view of how a child could develop into a psychopath. But a lot of clinicians believe this. A lot of clinicians believe that the psychopathy really can't be eradicated. Somebody can just adjust to that type of personality. But either way, we know that the bottom line is success in terms of society. We may not be able to eliminate psychopathy always, but we can still help children to develop into productive citizens as they move into adulthood. So again, it just kind of acknowledges the concerns and the seriousness around psychopathy. It would be dismissive, I think, to say, well, no, if a child has callous unemotional traits, there's no risk that they'll develop into psychopaths, and even if they do, we can work it out with treatment. That's just not the case. There is a risk, and the treatment is not always successful, and sometimes when it is, it's simply functionally successful in terms of society. It doesn't really change the underlying traits. Now, on the topic of treatment success, one of the trends I've seen over the last few years, and again, this is understandable, is a lot of agencies struggle to deal with children who have callous unemotional traits, especially if there's any violence involved. So what happens is they get kicked out of these agencies and get referred to agencies that in theory can handle these behaviors, but we see very few agencies that are willing to take children, especially again with the violent aspect included. So really the children that would be at the most risk to developing psychopathy. I remember visiting an agency a few years ago when I was walking through the hallway. So I was moving through these interior doors they had. So we had a hallway and I was going through these offices. And one of the offices didn't have a door. And it seemed unusual because it had a door frame and you could see at one time there were places where the hinges went, but they appeared to be torn out. So I asked one of the counselors who worked there what happened, and they were telling me that there was a child they were treating, and the child was around 8 to 10 years old, and they broke the door off the hinges. So they rammed their whole body into the door, including their head. So they just stood up, they got angry, and they rammed into the door repeatedly. So they were inside the office here with the counselor when this happened, until the door broke and it just fell into the hallway and then just walked away. So you saw that all the hinges again were ripped right out of the door frame, and apparently the doorknob was broken off the door as well. So they never bothered to replace it. They just used the office for something else. I don't know if it was storage or whatever they did with it, but they decided not to replace that door, and they decided for similar sessions they were just going to leave the door open. And they made some other changes to avoid that becoming a problem with confidentiality. And on top of that, they changed their policy so that any violence, if there's any violent act by any child, that was it. They were going to be discharged. Before, they had tried to work with a child, but after that, they weren't going to do it anymore. And I can appreciate both sides of this, right? We need to treat children who have these traits to help prevent them from becoming psychopathic, because the damage they can do as an adult, in theory at least, would be much worse. But we also have to protect counselors and staff. And nobody wants to work in a work environment where they're threatened and they have to fear for their safety. So I can appreciate, again, both sides of this. I'm not sure there's really any answer except more funding for agencies that are capable of handling children that are at risk to become psychopathic. But of course, it's always a simplistic answer when you say, well, throw more money at the problem. But I'm just not sure how else to address this issue. Counselors aren't going to work in fear, but we do have to address the psychopathy issue because of all the violent crime that's attached to it. So it's an interesting problem, and I wish I had a better answer in terms of a solution. Now, whenever I talk about topics like psychopathy and antisocial personality disorder, especially one like this, we're talking about the signs that could lead to it in children, I know that there are going to be a lot of strong opinions in various directions and different experiences. So if you have opinions that are the same as mine or different or other thoughts, please put those in the comments. As always, I hope you found my description.
Oh, looks like we got some good stories here. Looks like we got some good stories. Let's read some stories. I had a cousin who was around the age of 5, used to torture small animals slowly to death. His parents didn't get him help because of the social stigma of getting mental health services. They treated his behavior as if it was normal and gave him everything he wanted whenever he wanted it. Of course, it only got worse. He grew up to be an extremely violent gang member. He used to put me in the hospital regularly throughout my childhood. He was 3 years older than me and twice to 3 times my size. All I ever wanted was to have some adult make him stop, but no one ever did. Thanks for nothing for all those adults who were in the picture at the time and never lifted a finger to help me. I was a callous, unemotional child who was experiencing constant, severe sexual, physical, and emotional abuse, plus the abject neglect from the excuse that my excuse for a father slash my only parent. All of the triad except for the bedwetting, although my similarly abused siblings had all 3. I grew up to be an empathetic adult who works with child abuse survivors. Callous, unemotional children and are not all destined to be psychopaths. I have a curiosity about death and natural disasters, but I think a lot of people who've been through trauma are able to disassociate from their own trauma or understand their own pain by looking at suffering. I never got any treatment as a child. I just grew up, got out of the bad situation, and decided I didn't want to be like my abuser. I was diagnosed when I was 10 or 11 with a child with ASPD. I was in foster care. I was very angry, antisocial, and numb. I'm still dealing with the after effects of being labeled with that. I was literally called a monster constantly. I deeply hated everyone for a long time for that. In reality, I have had PTSD, ADHD, and autism. Part of me still hates the people that convinced me that I was a horrible person. The other part is desperately trying to prove them wrong. A few years ago, my wife and I were taking care of kids while their parents were attending a parenting class. The little boy, around 6 years old, seemed to be a potential psychopath to me. He didn't respect authority and was mean to the other kids. One time, he kicked my wife. We decided we better get one of his parents, who were in another room in the same building. She went to get them, but she was on her way. And as she was on her way, the boy told me in the flattest, least emotional way that you can imagine that he hoped something really bad would be happen to her before she got there, like somebody would shoot her at the building would burn and she would die in a fire. It was chilling. I don't think you can blame bad parenting in that case. They seem to be like nice people after all. They were taking a parenting class. I've often wondered what became of him. It felt like his parents needed a miracle of God, not just some nice tips on being better parents. As someone with Asperger's autism, I learned that about autism in a university class, and they made autistics sound like a bit like psychopaths, not like not having empathy, which is untrue. I wish more people knew that autistics have empathy, and studies have shown that they are actually more empathetic than non-autistic. I have a cousin with all 3 of these symptoms. Since he's been born, his parents really haven't been taking care of him. They haven't been neglectful, but they have been more free-range than anything else, allowing him to do whatever he wishes. Whenever he was 3, he'd chuck his toys and even knives at people who were just sitting down on the couch. He does it all the fucking time. Just minding their own business. No matter how many times he got punished for it, he'd do it over and over and over again and laugh every single time. Yeah, he would throw his books at me and I would tell him, well, I'm not reading that book because you threw it at me. And he didn't care. He didn't want me to read it. He wanted to throw it at me. You know, like... getting like of the little tiniest tiny toad right now. He also started to torture and hurt animals. When they bit back at him, he'd cry and blame it on the animals for it all, and his parents would believe him. Yeah, that's what he's doing to my cat right now. One time on my 17th birthday, we were all at the river catching little minnows. He was 4 around this time, and there was a fish that jumped out of the bucket where we kept the minnows in. He grabbed the bottle nearby and just kept hitting the fish until his body was torn up and splattered everywhere. And when I tried to stop him, he told me he'd killed me and that he hated me. He said that to a lot of people. He often told people, and he still does, that he'd kill and hurt them. The way he acts isn't only extended to animals. However, he and my younger brother, who was about his age, were often forced to hang out because they're family. So many times he'd hurt my little brother for no reason at all. He would just do it right in front of you and blame the other kid for why he did it, just by having no reason at all. He just does it to get a laugh. Even aside from my brother, when his baby sister was born, we noticed that she had scratches and bites on her, probably from him being jealous. And they were bathing once, and he fed her his poop, knowing she would eat it because she's a baby. He's 5 now, and although he may not seem as bad as he's always been, he does not seem as bad as he always been. He still is. He's just learned to hide it. I feel like that as he grows older, he'll develop into a psychopath. Sorry guys for this long rant. I just want to see what other people think of it. That's res on there. I don't want to get res in my dab. Oop. No, that's reclaim. It seems to be like reclaim on both sides. Sorry, this is dead air. It's not like anyone's watching anyway. Kind of lost in thought as well. I don't know. I think I'm gonna... When I was a child / early teens, my mom found conduct disorder online and diagnosed me with it. She'd tell my teacher I had it, and she'd ask people at church to pray for me that I didn't turn into a psychopath. Keep in mind, she never took me to a doctor or anything, just described it with her degree of Google U. It wasn't until I was in high school and had a teacher who helped tell when she learned that my mom didn't actually get an actual diagnosis and didn't have me in therapy at all. I was eventually diagnosed with Asperger's syndrome and OCD. I spent my whole childhood being told I was going to be this terrible person no one was ever going to want to be around because my mom just decided I had CD. When I was also diagnosed with bipolar disorder later, which runs in my family, and I was told I was always told growing up that my family members with it were just terrible people who just chose to be difficult by my parents. Needless to say, I'm an adult in therapy, PTSD from all that childhood trauma added onto it. I implore all parents to actually see a professional if you think your child is having problems. Don't Google diagnose them. Yeah. Excellent presentation. I have 35 years of experience as a child psychiatrist in juvenile justice institutions, and this is the best, most accurate synopsis of child conduct disorder in children I have ever seen. It should be mandatory for every school teacher, not that these children are necessarily treatable, but early detection is key. As a teacher, I can tell you that 90% or educators already know this. There is nothing that we can do except send them to a counselor and try to gently let the parents know that we've observed. We can never be allowed to insinuate any type of diagnosis with a child. I've come to the conclusion that the absence of love and affection as a child is possibly the most damaging factor. How is a person supposed to understand healthy relationships if neglect is the model they've normalized from? Indeed, if they were taught callousness, bullying, etc. as the standard, there's no wonder that this behavior becomes a habitual for the child. I'm a firm believer that the behavior is learned, and that is... No, there's no fucking way. There's no fucking way. Well, I guess he learned to hit dogs from my mom, but like he beats the cat up ever since then. It was like something that he learned, he picked up on, and he just never let go because it was something that rung in his head and something he fucking genuinely enjoys. It's not like I don't hit my fucking kid. Like there's no fucking way. You described my brother who was adopted at 2.5. I was adopted at 6 months. He returned to social services for the first adopting parents. If not for my adopted mother, I believe he would have ended up in jail. She had the patience and persistence to not give up on him. As a child, he was cruel to myself and small animals. As a child, my parents deliberately took the bedroom that was right between ours to keep me safe. He lit fires, stole, defaced school property with feces, lied, and cheated on me and my parents. He also exposed himself to me when we were both teenagers, but I had the courage to call his bluff. The hardest part for me is that she wasn't kind to me, even though I was the one who tried to be the pleaser and never create problems. Why did you say she? That she wasn't that kind to me, even though I was the one who tried to be the pleaser and never create problems. Having a parent who is inconsistent is also very abusive. Never knowing how your parent will be from day to day. My mother was like that. She would be loving one day and next time become a raving lunatic. She even threatened to kill us. We were often terrified of our mother. She was a prescription drug addict with no doubt added to the problem. My father was a cold man who was more interested in advancing his career and his self-image than it was happening to his children. I never felt safe anywhere, not even in my own home. I was extremely insecure in school and as well, and as fearful of other children, and cried a lot. I managed to grow past all of this and put my life together. Now I've been married many years and children and grandchildren. I see myself as a fortunate survivor. My sister was not. She committed suicide at 43. What does that have to do with this fucking video at all? Honestly. 158 replies because everyone's like, what's it got to do with this? It's hard for me to comprehend how someone's mother could be turned a blind eye, but in this case of a cousin, she did. At age 5, he already set 2 houses on fire, was caught drowning a neighbor's kittens, played with knives, and was also a bedwetter. She always made excuses. He already done hard time He's already done a hard time for other things more than once. As far as I know, he hadn't murdered anyone yet, but this is the type of if/when he does, no one would ever find the body. He never got therapy. She didn't believe in it.
Did you know that some people have a hard time recognizing angry or sad facial expressions? A study done with 16 to 21-year-old males who had conduct disorder and those who didn't found that the individuals with conduct disorder had reduced brain response when differentiating between neutral and angry faces. And when looking at sad faces, they showed an abnormal amygdala response.
But wait, if I can't recognize angry or sad emotions, does that mean I have conduct disorder?
Well, not quite. Actually, there's more to conduct disorder than just recognizing faces. So let's take a look. Let's follow our two friends, Pablo, who's 10 years old, and Lucas, who's 12 years old, to learn more about conduct disorder. In the DSM-5, conduct disorder is defined as a repetitive and persistent pattern of behavior where the basic rights of others or major age-appropriate societal norms are violated. For someone to be diagnosed with conduct disorder, they need to meet the following requirements. Show at least 3 of the 15 criteria in the past year, and one of these criteria should be present in the past 6 months. Their disturbance in behavior has to cause clinically significant impairment in their social, academic, or occupational functioning. Lastly, if they are older than 18, they cannot have met the criteria for antisocial personality disorder. Criteria for conduct disorder fall into these 4 categories: aggression to people or animals, destruction of property, deceitfulness or theft, and serious violation of rules. Let's look at Lucas. He's been showing the following symptoms for the past 3 years.